Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely important hearing. First, this is a cycle, and I've found a very, I didn't develop it, but found a very interesting chart that shows the water situation in the West over the last 1,200 years. And what it shows is up and down. And we are at the second lowest point that we've been. The last one was around 1,500. Interestingly, the West was settled and developed during a period of relative high water. And we're now in a situation where we're at this low point. One of the questions is, will the low point, historically these drought periods lasted about 20 years. The question is the climate change effect going to make it a much more permanent kind of situation? But anyway, I'd like to submit this chart for the record.
Without objection.
Second observation is that the amount of water in the world is constant. It never changes, hasn't changed since the dinosaurs. The question is, where is it? Unfortunately, right now, it's in a lot of places where it doesn't do you any good. In Greenland, I've flown over Greenland in a helicopter and seen the enormous amount of water. In one day last summer, 8 billion tons of Greenland melted. That's enough to cover Florida in 2 inches of water. And the question is, how do we move water? And Senator Langford asked the interesting question about pipelines. Now, and obviously a pipeline from Greenland isn't possible, but from other sections of the country, I think that's something that needs to be discussed. It's not something we've ever thought about before, but we have pipelines for oil and gas, and we do have, in some areas, huge pipelines for transferring water, for example, in New York State down to the city. Desalination we have to talk about. All that water in Greenland is fresh water that's going into the ocean. So I guess, Mr. Hall, how feasible is a massive desalination, how feasible and economically viable is massive desalination from the Pacific Southwest into this region to alleviate this problem? Is that just fantasy, or is there a possibility that is something that we could invest in and it would make a difference?
Thank you, Senator King. As a water resource engineer, I'll tell you that we like to build things, and we have studied lots of possibilities, and some we've implemented, some were good ideas, some turned out not to be so good ideas, and some are just not cost effective. And so with respect to pipelines and desalination, that cost issue is certainly a big one. Some of the most expensive water in the West, on the order of $2,000 an acre foot, comes from the desal plant that was recently completed, I think recently in the last 5 years or so, at Carlsbad in San Diego. And for San Diego, who is at the end of the Colorado River water distribution system.
But also adjacent to the ocean.
And adjacent to the ocean, with, in fact, an already existing outfall to help dispose of the brine at a lower cost. It made sense as part of a resilience portfolio for the city. And in some other targeted areas, desal does make sense.
But to reach the kind of scale to relieve this whole region is not really feasible. Is that your suggestion?
At this time, it is not feasible due to cost and other environmental issues.
And interestingly, looking at this chart, the drought sections are surrounded on both sides by more water, excessive precipitation, which suggests, as Senator Barrasso talked about, storage, but a lot of storage. I mean, a couple of years won't really solve it if you're talking about a 20 to 40-year cycle. So storage is part of the problem, part of the solution also, isn't it?
Certainly, storage can be really valuable, and especially in our current situation, can be a helpful tool in making our deployment of the water more flexible. In most of the West, frankly, there isn't enough water to fill the storage.
Today. But I'm talking about in the 80s, there was excessive rainfall in the West, which if we could have captured that and held it for 20 years, it might have helped. Let me ask one other, not a question, but just an observation. Fascinating experiment going on in California now of building solar panels over canals, which will generate electricity but also diminish evaporation. If you could build a solar farm on top of Lake Powell, you could supply electricity for all of the West and diminish the enormous water loss to evaporation. I'm not ready to undertake that project, but I think we've really got to think in new and different ways here, because this is, as many people say, unprecedented. At least it's unprecedented in the last 500 years. Thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Let me just thank the chair and ranking member for this important conversation.